In this ongoing series, I aim to chart the entire history of one of humankind's most spectacular art forms, animation. In this part, we'll discover the early pioneers at the dawn of celluloid film, from Thomas Edison and the Lumieres' first cameras, to the earliest experimentation of animation put to film by Georges Méliès and J. Stuart Blackton. This is the evolution of cartoons. Part 2. The Pioneers of Animation. By the late 1800s, mankind's desire to tell stories with moving imagery had hit new heights. Photosensitive chemicals were now used to print images onto paper, creating the first traditional photographs, and chronophotography had become relatively widespread, as academics used the art form to showcase successive phases of motion in moving objects via photography. This technique displayed a very primitive form of the motion picture, building the foundations of frame-by-frame animation of movement. It wasn't long before artists found ways to use these concepts to craft true motion pictures via the newly emerging art of cinematography. Louis Le Prince, a Frenchman working across the UK, inspired by the still successful magic lantern shows, invented an early motion picture camera, which allowed successive motion to be captured onto a strip of paper loaded into the device. Doubling as a deliverer or projector, the captured images could be threaded back through the device on a flexible band and projected. His film, Roundhay Garden Scene, a 3-second piece showing his friends and family walking around a suburban garden in Leeds, was produced in 1888 and is commonly considered the first ever motion picture. While Le Prince made incredible contributions to the art of cinema, his works did not have any immediate historical, commercial, or developmental influence. Without having presented his works publicly, they faded into obscurity following his mysterious disappearance in 1890. With his works discovered decades later, he is often referred to as the father of cinematography. It was, however, inventor Thomas Edison who would gain widespread acclaim for the early motion picture devices developed at his studio. Inspired by chronophotography, Edison and his team conceived a device which could play back such sequential images in rapid succession, as if viewing a picture in motion. Debuting publicly in 1894, the kinetoscope was a large cabinet with a peephole through which a viewer could watch the earliest motion pictures. Inside the cabinet were rows of images printed onto large strips of celluloid film, a transparent, synthetic plastic strip developed at George Eastman's Eastman Kodak Company in the late 1880s, which had quickly replaced the paper strip method of capturing images. The film strips, adorned by perforated edges, were moved through the device by sprockets driven by an electric mechanism, rapidly passing images over a light source with a high-speed shutter. These were not just the earliest films, but essentially animations made from photographs. Alongside the kinetoscope, the Edison studio also developed the kinetograph, an early motion picture camera which could rapidly expose and print sequential images onto celluloid film. These films were commercially distributed and exhibited to audiences across America and Europe beginning in 1894. Meanwhile, in France, Auguste and Louis Lumière, best known as the Lumière brothers, were developing the cinematograph, a similar motion picture device utilizing strips of celluloid film. This device, however, was a triple threat. It could capture, develop, and even project images. The Lumières first premiered their films publicly in 1895, a series of 10 50-second shorts headlined by their first film, Workers Leaving the Lumière Factory. Despite popular belief, the arrival of a train at La Ciotat station, arguably their most famous film, wouldn't premiere until the following year. Also in 1896, Edison began producing and theatrically distributing his own films using the Vitascope, a large projector his company was now manufacturing. While Edison and the Lumiere's works were mostly straightforward, single-shot pieces, it didn't take long for other artists to experiment with more technologically advanced films on celluloid. The The first of such auteurs was French actor, magician, artist and cartoonist Georges Méliès. Having seen a demonstration of the cinematograph, Lumière was instantly enamored, seeing an opportunity to blend his love of art and magic, and a chance to make his illusions more magical than he'd ever imagined. After a brief experiment with a makeshift camera he'd made by modifying an animatograph projector, he eventually purchased various mass-market cameras by Lumière and others as the devices became commercially available. In 1896, Méliès began producing wildly imaginative films. That year alone, Méliès produced 78 films, which grew more elaborate and more experimental. Screened to audiences, they were so commercially successful, he was able to build an extravagant glass studio in Montreuil. As Méliès experimented with the art of filmmaking, he invented and further developed some of the earliest special visual effects, many of them easily considered early forms of animation on celluloid film. Méliès's most utilized effect in this era was the stop trick, or substitution splice, a rudimentary form of stop motion that allowed characters and scenery to instantly appear, disappear, or transform via trick cuts. To achieve this, elements in front of the camera would be added, removed, or altered between frames. Méliès claimed he stumbled upon the basic yet effective trick by accident when his camera jammed during a shoot, though Edison and Alfred Clark had used the trick in their 1895 film The Execution of Mary Queen of Scots, the first known film to use it. Regardless, it's a trick that was perfected by Méliès and became a prominent part of his work. Méliès also used puppetry, painted props, and cut-out creatures, which were moved around the frame to bring some of the first cartoons to celluloid. 1896's A Terrible Night shows perhaps the earliest example of Méliès using puppetry, bringing an inanimate prop bedbug to life. Méliès also pioneered various other effects, including forced perspective, dissolves, double exposure, and hand colorization, where film strips were painted by hand in a manner similar to the later cell animation. All of Méliès's tricks helped create elaborate, fantastical, cartoony pictures. Films like 1902's A Trip to the Moon and Gulliver's Travels and 1903's Kingdom of the Fairies utilized all the tricks in his handbook, while 1904's Impossible Voyage incorporated sequences produced with miniatures and in-camera machinery effects that could be considered fully animated. Between 1896 and 1913, Méliès crafted more than 500 films, becoming a pioneer not only of motion pictures, but of animation. Around 1898, Gebrüder Bing, a German toy manufacturer, released the first toy cinematograph. This was essentially a modified toy magic lantern with a shutter, hand crank, and spools for perforated film strips. Short films were especially mass-produced. While more expensive live-action strips were available, cheaper variants, produced by printing drawings onto the strips, could also be purchased. Lasting only a few seconds, these film strips depicted a recurring cyclical action, which could be looped on the spool and projected, utilizing the basic structure of the earlier stroboscopic discs, zoetropes, and praxinoscopes. To create the animated films, live-action strips were traced with ink and paint. Some of Méliès's works even found themselves traced and animated for the toy. These animated strips not only displayed an early example of rotoscoping, a technique later used in cell animated filmmaking, but can also be seen as a precursor to cell animation in general. Back in the United States, Edison's inventions were influencing local artists as well. Following a demonstration of his Vitascope projector, Edison was interviewed at his studio by reporter James Stuart Blackton. The keen inventor also showcased his filmmaking abilities, demonstrating how quick and easy it was to make a short motion picture. Blackton, also an illustrator and stage magician, was captivated by the art of filmmaking, and much like Méliès, saw its potential in aiding his illusions. Blackton purchased a Vitascope and 10 short films from Edison, which he and his stage partner Albert Smith utilized in their productions to enormous success. By 1897, Blackton and Smith had formed the Vitagraph Company of America and opened the Vitagraph Studios, where they began making their own films in direct competition with Edison. Vitagraph began producing newsreels, propaganda shorts, and comedies, one of the most notable being a series based on Frederick Burr Opper's comic strip character Happy Hooligan, considered the earliest film adaptation of a comic. As we'll soon learn, this is not the only major inspiration comics had on early animation. In 1899, however, Blackton produced the Enchanted drawing, released in 1900. In the film, Blackton appeared drawing a cartoon face on a large easel. By applying Méliès's stop trick, Blackton was able to bring the drawing to life, almost seamlessly pulling elements out of his artwork and changing the expression on the face. It was, of course, incredibly simple, but Blackton's work here exemplifies what is commonly believed to be the first work of animation recorded on celluloid film, leading him to later be considered the father of American animation. A few years later, Blackton would make an accidental discovery that would herald the next evolution of the animated cartoon: stop motion. On the next installment, we chart the rise of early stop-motion animation between 1905 and 1909, touching on the revolutionary works of J. Stuart Blackton, Alexander Shirayev, Sayundo Deschamons, and Edwin S. Porter, right here on The Evolution of Cartoons.